Good evening, everyone. I'm Gretchen Crosby Sims. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Politics. We are so pleased to welcome Jeffrey Toobin to campus tonight for a discussion of the current Supreme Court term and perhaps some other news stories that might have legal dimensions. Few upcoming events. Next Thursday, May 17th, we're having former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, who will be discussing his new book, From Cold War to Hot Peace. The following Monday, May 21st, we're partnering with the Pulitzer Center for a discussion on the Myanmar refugee crisis. You can find out more about these and other upcoming events on our website at politics.uchicago.edu. We will have audience questions after our moderated conversation. We'll have the first three questions will be reserved for students. Please line up behind the microphone that will be in the various aisles, just this aisle, okay? Please reminder that questions end in a question mark. I imagine that we'll have quite a few this evening, so please try to keep them brief. Please make sure your phones are on silent. And here to formally introduce our speaker is Stacey Ryman. Stacey is a fourth year from Birmingham, Alabama, studying law, letters, and society. He is a member of the very successful UChicago men's soccer team and has served as a Fellows Ambassador for the IOP. Please join me in welcoming Stacey to the podium.
Thank you, Gretchen. Yeah, so thank you everyone for coming here today. The IOP is extremely proud to be hosting Jeffrey Toobin on our campus today. So you may know Mr. Toobin as a writer for The New Yorker, or you may know him as the chief legal analyst for CNN, or you may know him as the author of 8 books and ongoing ninth book, but these are all careers that I aspire to have, all packed into one. Born in New York City, Mr. Toobin moved to Cambridge for undergrad at Harvard, where he graduated magna cum laude with degrees in American history and literature, and earned himself a Truman Scholarship. Afterwards, he loved Harvard so much he stuck around for another 3 years and attended Harvard Law School, and again graduated magna cum laude. He was both a member of the Harvard Crimson during undergrad and was an editor at the Harvard Law Review during law school. So given his background, it is no surprise that Mr. Toobin achieved a successful career in writing. He has an upcoming book on the... Did you scoff at that? Should have paused there. So he has an upcoming book on the Russian probe and President Trump's administration, which unfortunately is strikingly topical. But for the purposes of today's event, I would like to focus on Mr. Toobin's resume covering the Supreme Court. So in his book, published in 2007, titled The Nine Inside the Secret World of the Supreme Court, Mr. Toobin addresses some of the same questions that we are here today to ask. So some of those questions include, how really does the institution of the Supreme Court function? What should we expect from the court and the justices that serve on it? And can we predict the future of the Supreme Court? And if so, what is that trajectory? Following the death of Justice Scalia and throughout the shortlist nominations for the recent Supreme Court appointment, Mr. Toobin published several New Yorker articles covering the politics of the modern court. One of those articles, titled The Supreme Court After Scalia, he foreshadowed the importance of the 2012 election on issues such as abortion and affirmative action. So here we are today, over a year and a half into Trump's administration, and the presence of politics in the court demands our attention. With rumors surrounding Justice Kennedy's retirement and the ages of other justices at play, the event will address questions and concerns surrounding how we might expect the Supreme Court to respond to its dynamic nature. The conversation will be moderated by David Strauss, Gerald Ratner Distinguished Service Professor of Law and Faculty Director of the new Jenner and Block Supreme Court and Appellate Clinic. He is an expert in constitutional law, having argued 19 cases before the Supreme Court. Now, without further ado, please welcome Jeffrey Toobin and David Strauss.
Thank you, Stacey. Welcome, everyone. Jeff, thank you for coming to see us, and welcome to the University of Chicago.
Thank you. So great here. You're so lucky to be here. I mean, it's just like so beautiful, and I walk by the Roby House. How exciting that is. My daughter lives in Chicago, Ellen Toobin. She grew up in New York, but she had the good sense to move to Chicago when she grew up. It's really, this is a very special place, and I know you all are affiliated here one way or another, and I just hope you appreciate how lucky you are to be here, because this is really a wonderful institution. And David, it's an honor that you agreed to participate.
Well, the honor's mine. Thanks. So our main topic is the court. So, I mean, a lot of times journalists write these end-of-the-year wrap-ups on the court's term. So, with due allowance for both crystal ball gazing and contingency planning, what do you think the end-of-the-year wrap-up is going to look like?
Well, the good news about working in cable news is there's no accountability for being wrong. So I am happy to make predictions about the way the term is going to end, because, so what? If I'm wrong. No, I mean, I think, this is, pushing the, 13th, I mean, since Justice O'Connor left, sorry, she didn't die, she left in 2005, basically every controversial case on the court has been decided by Anthony Kennedy, with one or two exceptions. And certainly that's the case. I think that's going to be the case this year. And I don't think there has been any period on the court with so much riding on a single justice's vote for so long in so many cases. I mean, in the period since I've been sort of a conscious follower of the court, there has always been a swing justice. In the 70s, Lewis Powell was mostly the swing justice. In the 80s and 90s, Justice O'Connor, was mostly the swing justice. But the coalitions somewhat changed, case by case. Basically, since Justice O'Connor left, and in retrospect, O'Connor's replacement by Justice Alito really was a major turning point in the history of the court, because as of 2005, when Alito replaced O'Connor, you had four pretty well locked in votes. Roberts, Alito, Scalia, and Thomas, and the question is, could they get Kennedy's votes? At the same time, you had four pretty liberal votes. First, Souter, Stevens, Ginsburg and Breyer, and then Sotomayor and Kagan replacing Souter and Stevens, so that you have this really deeply polarized 8 justices with, Kennedy holding the outcome. And, the probably 2 biggest cases outstanding are the Colorado Bakery case, the Masterpiece Bake Shop, and we can talk about it, and the redistricting cases, and both of them, I think, you have 8 votes pretty much locked in, and the question is which way he's going to go.
Right. I mean, you mentioned these replacements. I mean, one odd thing about the court, of course, it's only 9 people. And they stay there a long time. And they deal with each other a lot day to day, year after year. So when there's a new justice, it changes things a lot. And we both had a Justice Scalia leave, who was a presence, and then a new justice come. What do you make of the dynamics of that?
There's a famous quote from Byron White, who served on the court for a long time, who said, when you change one justice, you don't change one justice, you change the whole court. I don't really buy that. I don't believe that. I mean, I think, my view of the court generally is that this is a deeply political body. And, yes, it's true that Antonin Scalia and Neil Gorsuch are very different personalities and different backgrounds, different temperaments. Politically, they are virtually identical to each other. So I think the fact that Gorsuch replaced Scalia, is interesting in terms of dynamics, but it's not that interesting in terms of the outcome of cases. You know what would have been significant in terms of the outcome of cases? If Merrick Garland had replaced Antonin Scalia. A fact well known to Mitch McConnell, who prevented a vote for just that reason. And yes, I'm sort of arguing again. I find the internal dynamics of the court interesting. I find the personalities interesting. But mostly what matters is, are they Democrats or are they Republicans? And to me, the big story on the Supreme Court is the same as the big story in our broader political views, political life, which is the disappearance of moderate Republicans. You know, the Supreme Court was controlled by moderate Republicans for decades. Lewis Powell, Anthony, Kennedy is a special case, but O'Connor, Souter, Stevens, they're all gone. They don't exist in the United States Supreme Court, they don't exist in the United States Senate, and they don't exist on the planet Earth anymore. They are, moderate Republicans have disappeared, and the court now reflects that, with the weird exception of Anthony Kennedy, who is not really in any sense, in my opinion, a moderate. He is actually an extremist with eccentric sensibilities. He is an extreme supporter of the right and the left, depending on the handful of cases in which he is on the left, most significantly gay rights. But other than that, he's pretty conservative.
Yeah. So you don't buy the idea that Justice Scalia, for example, by going after some of his colleagues and his opinions, pushed them away, and that actually made the court more liberal than it would otherwise have been.
That was certainly the hypothesis with regard to Justice O'Connor, right? That Justice O'Connor joined the court in 1981. Scalia joined in 1986. That was the period where there were these deeply controversial cases about the future of abortion rights. You know, it really did seem for a while like Roe v. Wade might be overturned. Yeah. And there is the hypothesis that O'Connor and Kennedy were both repelled by Scalia's, really deep hostility on the abortion cases and his contempt and his ridicule. I don't know. I think they were going to. I think there's always this argument: are the justices influenced by each other?
Right.
Not so much. And the bigger the case, the less they're influenced by. A lot of the cases are very low profile, and in those cases, sure, they might be and they're less explicitly political. But these justices don't need another justice to tell them whether abortion is a right protected by the Constitution. It's like, oh, I wonder what Anthony Kennedy thinks about it. Like, they know what they think on these issues. And I think this myth, Brennan was the famous, he corralled all these votes. Justice Breyer has there's a funny, there's a story that Justice Brennan used to ask his law clerks every year. What's the most important rule at the Supreme Court? And they'd say, oh, is it freedom of speech? And he'd hold up his little hand and he'd say, 5. With 5 votes, you can do anything you want around here. And Breyer likes to say, it was easy for him to say because he started with 7 votes. He had 7 liberals on the court. So, it wasn't that easy. It wasn't that hard to win cases.
Yeah.
So, I think this idea that they're sort of influenced or offended by each other is not so true.
Well, at least in the very high-profile cases,
yes.
right?
And in the low-profile cases, I don't pay attention anyway, so.
Yeah, because you're on cable TV.
Yeah, I'm on cable TV.
Yeah. Wouldn't you think that at some point they get exasperated with each other? Like, I've really just had enough of Justice so-and-so, he's a pompous prig. Don't you think they...
Well, you know them. What do you think? Don't you think? It's like being stuck in like the world's longest Thanksgiving dinner.
Yeah, it is. Yes, it is.
That's like we can't, we just can't escape, but you can't go somewhere else.
Yeah, I do think there's some of that. But I agree with you that on the very high-profile cases that make the front page of the paper, or your broadcasts, they know what they think.
I don't just do cable news. I write about things. It's
Is that right? The occasional book.
Right. So it's not quite that high.
Yeah. But I agree with that. Actually, I should say one thing that is commonly said among advocates is that it's much more fun to argue a boring little case because you might actually persuade them.
Right. One question I've asked several justices of a variety of political spectrum is, how often is your mind changed? Here, I'll ask you. How often do you think the justices say their minds are changed by oral argument in a given term?
Well, it's hard to say on just what you were saying on the high-profile cases, unless there's some technical wrinkle, never. Otherwise, half a dozen times.
Twice a year, they say.
Yeah.
Now, they don't say, the briefs, they take, they say that they're persuaded. But they say, oral argument twice a year. And I haven't asked them in that context, but I'm sure they are almost exclusively low-profile cases.
Right.
Because, the way you get and also, the scrutiny of nominees now is so intense by the appointing president that, there's been this myth at the court that presidents are surprised by how the justices turn out. This myth dates primarily to the Eisenhower administration, where it is certainly true that Earl Warren and William Brennan turned out to be much more liberal than Eisenhower thought. Let me say one thing about the Eisenhower administration. It was a long time ago. And if you look at the presidents appointed since then, you could argue Harry Blackmun, David Seward, by and large, and certainly all 9 justices on the court now, what you see is you could have more or less predicted how all these justices would vote on virtually every case. And that's what the presidents want, and that's what they get.
I think what is where the surprise comes in is if the issues of the day change.
Right.
So Nixon appointed law and order justices and didn't think he was appointing the justices who would have something to say about abortion.
Right.
So they may have surprised him. But that actually leads me to the next thing I wanted to ask you, which is speaking of things changing. And there are a lot of us who think what's going on now with the Trump administration is historically a turning point and a threatening era, and really different and shouldn't be approached in the way we've approached other administrations. Do you think any of them on the court think that?
Well, I certainly don't think 4 of them think that. Well, 3, I should say. One of the interesting, I certainly think Alito, Thomas, and Gorsuch are signed on completely, that they are going to support Trump's agenda, Trump's position on legal issues regardless. I think they are locked in on that. And I think Breyer, Ginsburg, Sotomayor, and Kennedy and Kagan are locked in opposed. As we've discussed, Kennedy is harder to predict depending on the issue. I think the role of John Roberts is potentially very interesting because the title in the Constitution is not Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The title is Chief Justice of the United States. And John Roberts takes that very seriously. John Roberts recognizes that he is the custodian of the reputation, not just of the Supreme Court, but of the American judiciary. And I think, I'm not going to, he's not any born-again moderate, but there are aspects of Trump's personality, of the way Trump has approached issues that I am certain offend John Roberts. And depending on how issues come up, I think there is some chance that Roberts' personal distaste for Trump might overlap into voting against him. But, you look at the travel ban case, he's not voting against Trump. Now, I think the travel ban case got a lot easier for the court since the travel ban itself went through 3 iterations, each one less obviously unconstitutional. So I think I think Roberts is going to be signed on there. But certainly, if you just know anything about John Roberts as a human being, this is someone who really cares about the dignity of the office, the dignity of the presidency, certainly the dignity of the court. And, I don't think, the Chief Justice wears a MAGA hat in his spare time. Mm-hmm. But it's whether that translates into actual votes against Trump, haven't seen it yet, and I don't know if we will.
Right. The travel ban argument didn't seem to
No, and also, the travel ban argument was about fundamentally the constitutional powers of the presidency. And this has been a subject very close to Robert's heart. He was in the White House counsel's office under Reagan. He was Deputy Solicitor General under George Herbert Walker Bush. He's very protective of the institutional prerogatives of the executive branch. And so I never thought his vote was in play. And I actually think Elena Kagan might vote with the majority in that one as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, what about the liberal justices, whether they, at least some of them, would feel reluctant that in their minds they're thinking, I can't treat Trump differently from the way I would treat another president. I'm a judge. I shouldn't be doing that.
Yeah, I don't want to pretend that I have access to that level of internal cognition that's going on at the justices. I do think, though, the tribalism that is so familiar to us, Democrats being Democrats, Republicans being Republicans down the line, is present at the court. And you don't see the four liberals break ranks in controversial cases very often at all. And even though Elena Kagan, who also has significant experience in the executive branch, unlike the three other liberals, might have her vote in play in that one. At the end of the day, I think she'd prefer to see it a 5-4 decision.
Yeah.
Losing 5-4 rather than helping them make it 6-3.
Yeah, even if she could extract some concessions.
That's a level of detail that I don't pretend to know.
That actually leads to something else, which was there was a long period, a year or more than a year, when there are only 8 members of the court. And of course, the court divides 4-4. It can't decide anything. It has to leave lower court opinion standing. So there was a sense that they were kind of pulling together and trying not to divide 4-4 all the time. And they divided 4-4 sometimes, but sometimes you could kind of see this was an opinion where they deliberately wrote a narrow opinion that could get more than 4 votes. And you got the feeling that there was a sort of coalition building in the center of the court. Let's not let things divide 4-4. And that was the Chief Justice, Justice Kennedy, to a degree, Justice Kagan, Justice Breyer. Any trace of that? Or is that
I think that was a phenomenon distinctly related to the fact that there were 8 justices. Those were a great couple, basically a great year plus for the liberals. You had Justice Kennedy reaffirming the right to affirmative action in the Texas case. Right. You had a very strong abortion decision by Justice Breyer in the Texas case. So, those were good times for the liberals. Those days are over, and I just think they may get Kennedy's vote here and there, but there's no doubt who's winning now.
Yeah, and you don't see the Chief Justice being averse to 5-4, 5-4, 5-4 predictable split.
I not enough to change his vote. I'm sure he'd prefer that these decisions not be 5-4. But what is he going to become a supporter of Roe v. Wade? No. He's going to be supportive of gay rights? No. I think he, like the rest of them in these high-profile cases, he believes what he believes, and I think he's going to express it.
Yeah. So let me ask you this: if there is a Kennedy retirement, or if one of the liberals leaves the court and the court becomes just very solidly conservative, the question is this: the court's kind of had this, actually, historically speaking, a lot of prestige over the last generation or so. And a few years, one of his State of the Union addresses, President Obama criticized the Citizens United decision, and everybody was shocked because he made some mild criticism of the court. But historically, there have been presidents who really went after the court, and the roll call is impressive. President Jefferson, Jackson, Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, all really went after the court in a very aggressive way. And that hasn't happened. And you wrote the great book on the 2000 election, where the court actually decided a presidential election against the popular vote winner, and the popular vote winner said, okay. So the question would be, if the court becomes sort of locked in a conservative way, would there be an effort on the left to discredit the court?
Well, probably on the part of some, but one of my favorite quotes about the court comes from one of my favorite justices, the best writer I think ever to appear on to serve on the court, Robert Jackson, who served on the court, Franklin Roosevelt appointee, who said in an opinion about the court, "We are not final because we are infallible. We are infallible because we are final." Somebody's got to have the last word, and they have the last word. And so, if the court gets solidly conservative, if Kennedy, Ginsburg, Breyer, to say nothing of all of them, are replaced by, I think that the court will become more of a target on the left than it used to be. But so what? It's not going to change anybody's votes. And one of the things Donald Trump has decided, and I think politically it has served him very well, is that he is going to give the base of the party, the right wing of the party, the courts. Mm-hmm. And when you talk out in the real world to Republicans who say, "Oh, I wish you wouldn't tweet so much," they say, but the courts are great, and Gorsuch is great, mm-hmm. and he's going to continue doing that. And when he, was smart enough during the campaign to go to Leonard Leo of the Federalist Society and say, "Give me a list of Supreme Court nominees," he got that list. And it wasn't because Donald Trump had studied their opinions. It was because he had outsourced Supreme Court appointments to the Federalist Society. And I did a piece in the New Yorker about this. I mean, it's not like this was some secret. And that's who's going to get appointed to the Supreme Court. We're not going to have Harriet Miers. We're not going to have, some friend of Donald Trump. We are going to have people who are, as Leonard Leo, the executive vice president of the Federalist Society, likes to say, 100%ers. Justice Gorsuch is not liberal on some issues and conservative. He is 100%er. And that's what every Donald Trump appointee to the Supreme Court is going to get. And it's why, Donald Trump can have sex with Stormy Daniels till the end of time, and the evangelicals will still love him to pieces because of the courts.
Yeah, no, it's been a very disciplined, the Republicans in the Senate have been very disciplined about the way they've gone about this, starting with Court of Appeals appointments where they'll be more influential. And if they lose the Senate, at least they will have gotten lots of Court of Appeals judges. No, I think that's right. I mean, the scenario would be something like a Democratic president, Democratic House and Senate, very Republican court, and some kind of threats of, okay, we will obey specific court orders, but not taking it any further.
Well, this is,
fight you every step of the way.
Well, and this is, where I think it's useful to think about the issues on the horizon for the court, which are, look, abortion is always, the end of Roe v. Wade is the number one goal of conservatives on the Supreme Court, and it has been for decades. And, look, if Kennedy leaves, Roe v. Wade is going to be overturned, period. Period. End of story. No doubt about it. But that's only the beginning. And I think the issue to keep an eye on about the court is judicial efforts to limit the administrative state, mm-hmm. which is, and the Obamacare case was really the preview of this, is that it won't be enough for the court simply to crack down on civil liberties in the issues that we're familiar with. But it will be the Supreme Court saying to Congress, you can't legislate in this area because it's off limits, or saying to the executive branch, you can't pass administrative orders or executive orders in this area because Congress didn't authorize it specifically. I think, if you want to think about sort of the issues on the horizon for the Supreme Court, if it goes very conservative, yes, it's easy to talk about abortion, and it's obviously very important to talk about abortion, but I think the issue that most people don't think about and realize, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this because this is an area I know you're very knowledgeable about, is the sort of limitations on government action writ large.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's been a conscious offensive by the Federalist Society and the right to cut back on the administrative state, as you say. And it took the forms that you say, limiting Congress's power to a degree, but mostly making it much more difficult for regulatory agencies to do their jobs. So the EPA, the SEC now have to jump through more hoops, get less deference from the courts. That's been a very conscious agenda item. Now, one interesting question is, now that they are running these agencies increasingly, will they decide these agencies aren't so bad after all?
Well, that is a great question, but it's a lot easier to approve, if you were a conservative, the removal of regulations as opposed to approving the imposition of regulations. Right. And what the Trump administration has largely been doing is removing these. And there have been some courts that have said, like on DACA, the Dreamers and whatnot, you've done it too fast. You haven't jumped through enough hoops. But in 4 years, they're going to jump through all the hoops.
That, as they did with the travel ban.
The travel ban case.
Yeah. I mean, actually, something that what you said made me think of is one place where the court has actually moved in a liberal direction since the Berger Court is some criminal justice issues. They have been a little friendlier to criminal defendants' rights. They've been very friendly to white-collar criminal defendants.
Well, Justice Scalia in particular, he had a thing about the confrontation clause,
right,
which, and people said, oh, he's so liberal, he voted against, convictions, always of white-collar criminals. Death penalty, send them off ASAP. But white-collar criminals, he had a good deal of sympathy for. And look, when I say these, caustic and unpleasant things about the justices, they all are intelligent human beings, and they're not robots. And you will always find a case or two where they don't vote in exactly the way you would think. And that applies, I think, in the criminal justice area. And that was true of Justice Scalia. Yeah. But, it's really at the margins and in mostly esoteric cases.
Yeah. Well, I think that's right. The question would be whether the sort of libertarianish tendencies on the right now could produce some good things.
Well, you talk about one area where I think the libertarian strain has merged with the liberal strain is certain free speech areas. What was that case with that horrible church? Westboro Baptist Church, where, they disrupted a funeral. And it was an 8-1 opinion where they said, you know what, we don't like the Westboro Baptist Church either, but that's why we have a constitution. And Chief Justice Roberts wrote a really eloquent, sort of freedom for the speech that we hate kind of opinion. And that, I think, is one area where sort of there's close to a consensus. Where there's not a consensus is, and here is another area where I think the right is going to make a lot of progress, is freedom of speech as a tool to strike down government regulation.
Oh yeah.
That and this merges with church-state issues, and the Masterpiece Bakery case is a great example of this. Just for those of you who are not familiar, the Masterpiece Bakery case, very simple facts. Colorado, unlike the United States as a whole, has a law that says you can't discriminate against gay people. Two men are getting married. They go to this bake shop. We want a wedding cake, and the bakery says, no, it violates my religion to make a wedding cake for a same-sex couple. They sue under the Colorado law. The defense is that we as bakers, and we are reflecting our religious beliefs, and you're forcing us to serve this cake violates our religious convictions. The Trump Justice Department wrote a really brilliant brief that was totally pitched to Anthony Kennedy, where they said, being a baker is like being an artist. It's the only brief I've ever read in the Supreme Court that deals extensively with the question of icing. Where it's like being, it's like creative, and like where a telling a baker how to make a wedding cake is like telling a poet to write a poem or a painter to make a painting. And you can't do that. That's a violation of their First Amendment rights. Kennedy has a real love for the First Amendment. I mean, one would argue in Citizens United an excessive love for the First Amendment. But I think that argument is going to win Kennedy's vote. But once you tell a baker that his wedding cakes are like a creation that you can't force him, well, we are very close to the inn owner who says, the way I decorate my rooms is just, is such an expression of my views. You can't tell me I have to rent to gay people, the universe of areas where you get to use your First Amendment rights to discriminate against gay people grows, and I think that's an area to keep an eye on.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and the way I express myself is in this is my firm that I've worked all my life to set up.
Yeah.
And the way
we
I
have a
express
crucifix
myself
on
is
the door.
The way I hire people, and then the whole civil structure of civil rights laws can unravel. I think that's a risk. So a year from now, what would a conversation like this be? Great if we had this conversation again, but you probably have some other things on your agenda. But hypothetically, what would it look like?
Well, look, I mean, my rule on Supreme Court resignations is those who know don't tell, those who tell don't know. Notwithstanding that, I think Kennedy probably will not leave this term. He hasn't really given any indications. He's hired clerks, and so I think a year from now the court is likely to be similar or identical to the way it is now. However, Stephen Breyer is 79, Anthony Kennedy is 81, Ruth Ginsburg is 85. 85 is not the new anything. 85 is 85, and but John Paul Stevens still served till he was 90. So maybe Anthony Kennedy's just warming up. It's just very hard to know. But just to go back to your original question, if Kennedy leaves, they're going to get another Gorsuch, who is voting with Clarence Thomas more than he's voting with Alito. I mean, this is the new Republican Party. They are going to scrutinize these future justices in a way so that they're not leaving anything to chance. So, I don't know who it will be, but whoever it is going to be a fifth vote to overturn Roe v. Wade, just for starters.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's bleak.
Depends on your perspective. Maybe it's great.
I think we are at the point where we should start taking questions. And I'm supposed to remind everyone the rule is the first four questions, is that right? First three questions come from students.
It's always hard to ask the first question. Do we have just one microphone? All right, well, there we go. All right, yes, you're student looking. I don't know if you are a student.
For another month.
Another month.
Maybe it's because we're in Illinois, but I think one of the most consequential cases coming up is Janice versus Ask Me. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on how, when that will be decided.
This is the union voting case?
Right, exactly.
Oh, this is a lay down, dead over case. I mean, you will do a better job explaining precisely the issue in it. But the court, there was a 4-4 version of it while Scalia was gone, but all the other votes are known.
Yeah, it has to do with public employee unions. Public employee unions are required as part of public employees working in a place that is organized by a union are required to pay dues to support the non-political activities of the union. So the union engages in collective bargaining, but also engages in a lot of kind of day-to-day housekeeping on behalf of the employees. And at places that are public employee workplaces that are unionized, the employees have to pay dues for that share. Unions might also engage in political activities, and there's an old decision that says you don't have to pay anything to contribute to that. But when the union is serving your interests as an employee, you have to pay for that. The argument in this case is that that violates these employees' First Amendment rights because they are contributing support for political activities with which they disagree. What political activities, you might say? I thought the idea was they're exempted from contributing to political activities. The argument is, no, everything public employee unions do is political because they're negotiating for wages and salaries or working conditions that will affect the state's budget. So everything they do is political. And the argument that therefore you cannot require people who work there to contribute to the support of the unions because it would violate their First Amendment rights, which was just kind of invented half a dozen years ago, has gained a lot of traction. It's a perfect example of what Jeff said about the First Amendment being used as an instrument of deregulation, in this case combating the union movement. And the problem is that once people are able to take advantage of union membership or of the union's work without contributing, who will join the union? Why would you do it? Why would you voluntarily pay money to the union when it's going to succeed or it's going to fail irrespective? And so public employee unions will have a very difficult time surviving. This has been, as Jeff said, it was Justice Alito who wrote an opinion.
In particular.
Yeah, wrote an opinion several years ago really inviting this challenge.
Yeah.
And it's come before the court 2 or 3 times. They divided on it. A couple of times they resolved on narrow grounds, and there was a 4-4 version. But I agree that the argument they had on it in the fall suggests that this is over. And it will be, it's possible public employee unions will still survive, but it'll be very difficult for them to survive in this environment.
David has they gave a characteristically savvy, intelligent, clear. My attitude is, you think they hate private sector unions? They hate public sector unions the most, and this is a chance to screw them royally, and they are going to absolutely take advantage of it.
Do you know what the time frame for the decision is?
It'll be by June, end of June.
Hi, you've spoken a bit about the Masterpiece Bake Shop case, but I'm wondering if you could also share your thoughts on the gerrymandering case.
Well, this is, to me, potentially the most important case the court has dealt with, in a very long time. And it's up there with Obergefell. It's up there with the Obamacare cases. The case, in simple, as my father used to say, to make a long story unbearable. Dad. The act of drawing district lines has always been a political act, but in recent years, through the use of computers and specially designed software, it's been Congress, state legislatures have been able to draw district lines so that most seats are uncompetitive. That most seats are reserved for one party or the other, and of course the party in power reserves most seats for itself. The Wisconsin case, in round numbers, the votes, the actual voters in the state of Wisconsin are like 52-48 Democratic over Republican, but the Republicans control over 60% of the seats because of how they've drawn the lines. There have been many legal challenges to versions of this over the year, but finally, it looked like there was this case out of Wisconsin that was so egregious and so terrible that it looked like the court, and it still looks like the court might strike this down in some way. Kennedy seemed to be somewhat receptive, at least in the Wisconsin case. There was a second redistricting case out of Maryland where Kennedy seemed less inclined to do it, and I have to, I don't confess to a rooting interest in many of these cases, but I certainly have a rooting interest in this one. I think redistricting is, gerrymandering is so poisonous. It's one of the reasons why there's so little compromise in our state legislatures and in our Congress, because we don't have politicians that need to appeal to voters of the opposite party. I've grown more pessimistic. I think they're just going to say it's too difficult a problem and we're going to leave it to the political side. What do you think?
I have almost exactly the same reaction after the Wisconsin case, which was argued in the fall. It really looked as if they might do something, and Justice Kennedy has been on this issue. But they've done some funny stuff. They took the Maryland case when it wasn't obvious why they were hearing the Maryland case, and then the Maryland case, they seem to be backing away from it. So I don't know if they're going to do anything. What you said about, the world really has changed, and gerrymandering has become so efficient now. If they see that, if they understand, this isn't like the days of Elbridge Gerry, who gave his name to it, drawing lines on a map.
Well, I think there are a lot of reasons for the disappearance of moderate Republicans. But one of the reasons is there are no districts where they can win anymore. Right. Either districts are very Democratic, or they are very Republican, and moderate Republicans lose primaries now. The party is so conservative, you don't have moderate Republicans that can get nominated anymore. And this contributes to the extreme polarization, both at the federal and state level. So, I think it's an enormously significant issue, but I'm not as optimistic as I was about the court taking it on.
Thank you.
So you talked about how the court right now is so both political and predictable. If in a perfect world, really far from our current one, we could reshape it into whatever we wanted on a structural level, is there something we can do to make that less so, or is any court of 9 people we're going to build end up in exactly that kind of way?
Well, I think that's a really great question, and a version of it is, it's like, why do they have to be so political? Why can't they just deal with the law? That's a version of that question, and that's an area where I feel a great deal of sympathy for the justices, which is, I don't think you can address these questions in a non-political way. Does the Constitution protect a woman's right to an abortion? Can a university consider race in admissions? I don't think, I think you have to have a political philosophy as well as a judicial philosophy in order to answer that question. And, and I just want my side to win. And I think that's where, and that's the way it's always been at the court. And so I don't really fault the justices for being political. I just am keep counting noses of what side's winning. And I don't think that there is some way you could sort of construct a technocratic solution that would eliminate this problem. Do you?
Well, I'll tell you what the kind of standard answer would be, but I agree with Jeff, it's probably not going to happen. The standard answer would be leave more things to politics, leave more things to the democratic process. And, unless the political process has either done something egregious, or you're in a situation like what we confronted in the civil rights era, where you had people who were being disenfranchised and really couldn't protect themselves in the political process, the court should stay out. That would be the standard answer. I don't think that view, I'm sure that view ever had a lot of adherence on the court. It has zero adherence now. No one on the court has that view. And so on one side, it is gay rights and the argument that, really the political process was solving the problem of gay rights pretty well. Why didn't the court stay out? That would have gotten nowhere with the liberals. And on the other side, gun rights or any of these other issues, affirmative action, campaign finance, the idea, look, leave that to politics. That's going to get nowhere with the conservatives. But that would be the kind of con law class answer to your question. But it is very, very much out of keeping with where the court is today.
Thanks.
How do you think the court would rule on structure of government issues relating to the so-called unitary executive? And in particular, supposing Congress managed to enact a statute fortifying the independence of an independent counsel, would the Supreme Court continue Morrison against Olson or overturn it?
Well, remember, Morrison v. Olson was about the independent counsel law, where the independent counsel was appointed by a 3-judge court, not by the Justice Department the way Muller was. Muller is an employee of the Department of Justice, so I don't think there is even a constitutional argument where Muller is vulnerable. I mean, Muller is vulnerable to be fired by Rod Rosenstein or his replacement. But I don't think there's a constitutional argument against Mueller's status. I think he has a political problem that he might get fired by the president. The unitary executive, that's a really broad subject, and I think it's hard to answer in the abstract. But I do think, this also goes back to what you were saying earlier. Conservative justices like a strong executive when it's a Republican president. And I think that'll be the view mostly in this period. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think that's basically right.
If I understand correctly, the number 9 isn't constitutionally mandated.
Certainly not.
And in light of McConnell's blocking of Merrick Garland, if there's a blue wave that takes over in 18 and 20, do you see expansion of the court to combat that?
Well, you certainly will hear. David asked me at the very beginning, do you think you will start to see sort of structural critiques of the court if you have a Democratic president, Democratic Congress, very conservative court? And certainly the idea of raising the number of justices, some people will start to talk about. The problem with that is, FDR's court packing plan of 1936, is that what 36 was? Has 37, right? It was when he was inaugurated to his second term. It is generally considered the nadir of the FDR presidency, and what was a pretty transparent device to try to get his views imposed on the court through this sort of fig leaf of helping out the elderly justices. It's one of those subjects that comes up periodically, but you'd have to amend the Constitution, or would you?
No, you can do it by statute.
You could do it by statute?
Yeah, that's what Roosevelt tried to do.
Oh, that's right. It was by statute, of course, yeah. I don't know. That'd be a good story for me to cover, but I don't think it's going to happen.
Changing gears radically, you did a great series and wrote a great book about the Patty Hearst kidnapping.
Thank you.
Do you mind me asking a question about that? Okay.
Not at all. You can take all the time you like. No.
No, seriously. My father worked at KQED, was on the show Newsroom, so I have a very vivid memory of the whole thing going down and the whole story. One thing struck me particularly as Bill Harris was speaking, that today, with all the digital technology and the digital footprints we leave, they wouldn't have been able to hide in plain sight like they did. What are your thoughts?
Well, I suspect not all of you know the Patty Hearst case. Just to give you a little update, Patty Hearst was an heiress to the Hearst newspaper fortune. Many of you not heard of newspapers, but trust me. But they were like a big thing in their day, and there was a lot of money made. In 1974, she was kidnapped by this group called the Symbionese Liberation Army, this radical leftist group in Berkeley. And long story short, she wound up joining with them and robbing banks with them, and she was later arrested. And the question was, did she really join with the terrorists, or was she brainwashed or forced to do it? Anyway, that's what I wrote this book. And she was on the run with them for a year and a half, and that's what your question is, couldn't they have found her? The FBI in 1974 was at a particularly incompetent moment in its history. They had just, J. Edgar Hoover had just died in 1972. And, and his idea of an FBI agent was like a crew-cut graduate of Fordham who wore like black Oxford shoes all the time. They found it surprisingly difficult to infiltrate counterculture organizations. So they really had very few contact, and so I don't think it was so much the absence of the technology. She was on the run with the SLA for a year and a half and wasn't caught, which is the basis for the question. So would they have caught? It's hard to imagine that they could have been any slower to catch her. I mean, my God, a year and a half. She was the most wanted person, but I don't really know for sure.
So changing gears back a little bit, can you talk about Mitch McConnell's refusal to hold hearings in an election year? Do you think that sticks as a precedent if, for example, the Democrats have some takeover in 2018, have some leverage, and then refuse to stack the court with more conservatives? And if it does become a precedent, do you see that as necessarily problematic, or is that just a balancing of the powers?
Well, look, I mean, this is a totally fascinating question, and I think, I think it's indicative of a couple things. It's indicative of how important the courts are to Republicans generally. I don't think you would ever see a Democrat tell before this, tell a Republican president with 11 months left in his term that we will not consider anyone you nominate. It was not part of the DNA. Harry Reid wouldn't have done it, Chuck Schumer wouldn't have done it. I bet they'll do it now. Because if by some chance, and it's not out of the question, if the Democrats retake the Senate, there will not be another Supreme Court nominee considered until 2021. The base of the Democratic Party will burn down Chuck Schumer's office if he allows a Trump nominee on the Supreme Court. I mean, I think we are in a ratcheting level of partisanship here. I mean, this is a symptom of how partisan it's become, and I think there is no way Chuck Schumer and Dianne Feinstein, who would be the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, will hold hearings on a Trump nominee, even if one comes up in the first year. I mean, in 2019. Scalia died on February 14th, 2016. So certainly there would be no vote after that. But I think there is so much bitterness in the Democratic Party over the way Merrick Garland was treated that if Schumer has the chance, he will be obliged to stop any Trump nominee. I'm not clear he'll have the chance.
And so is that a toxic perversion of the Constitution, or is that a sort of fair game balance of powers?
I mean, I tend to be a sort of fan of partisanship. I mean, I sort of think, politics ain't beanbag, and if you can win, you should win. I don't think the Constitution was set up so that only if the president's party is in control of the Senate, do you get a vote on a Supreme Court nominee. I do think it's a perversion of the process. But, I also don't think unilateral disarmament's a great idea either. And these seats are awfully precious and awfully important. And, is Chuck Schumer supposed to approve the end of Roe v. Wade just to prove what a bipartisan kind of guy he is? I don't see a lot of support for that idea. What do you think?
Yeah, I'd say one thing to that. It's an important question, and it tells you something about the way the Constitution works, and tells you something about the way things break down. I mean, you asked, is it part of the Constitution? Of course, there's nothing in the Constitution that says the Senate has to consider a president's appointee. It just says the Senate has to advise and consent. The Senate can withhold consent. But the understanding had been that when the president nominates someone, the Senate will consider that nominee, at least if it's not in the immediate run-up to the election. But even more important, what happens when there is a Senate controlled by one party and the president of the other party, the kind of tacit understanding was, we will send up someone you can live with. We won't send up the person we would send up if our party controlled the Senate. So we won't send up someone at the edge of the Democratic Party. We'll send up someone, it's going to be a Democratic nominee, but it'll be someone that is as close, as plausibly close to the Republicans' views. President Obama did that consciously. President Obama actually picked Merrick Garland, who was very moderate and I hate to say it because he's my age, old, rather than someone, he's giving up 20 years of a nominee, suppose someone in his 40s, and giving up someone who had been much more liberal. And the reason he did it was because he thought this is the way you play the game. You say to the Republicans,
How'd that
I'm
work
going to
out?
do that. And it didn't work out.
Yeah.
And it didn't work out. He actually was attacked by people in his base for not nominating a younger person who was more left-wing and maybe a member of a minority group.
Now, I couldn't help but notice that your question sent Brother Axelrod screaming from the room almost. but can I, David, can you talk about this issue?
Yeah.
Because I know you thought about this, and No, seriously. I mean, I know
we just had this.
We were
we
talking
just did
about
a
this in your
podcast, and
office.
we just had this discussion, and I am concerned about the look. I think you stated it right, which is we are in this kind of downward spiral, and so each kind of incursion on norms is met by another incursion on norms. And McConnell took a huge step. You're quite right, David, that I know that President Obama consciously, he held Merrick Garland out as a potential nominee when Democrats had the Senate, with the thought that he would be a good nominee when there was a Republican Senate, on the theory that they were going to play by the rules as the rules had been written in the past, and that wasn't the case. So, I mean, I have concerns about where this is all leading. And, you know, the question, Jeffrey, your basic argument is you can have concerns, but it is what it is. And you can either surrender or you can stand on principle and graciously accept defeat. And, you know, I find that an unhappy choice. So I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm going to repurpose your question because I don't have a great answer for you. Other than that, I think we should be concerned about the loss of norms and the loss of decorum and the loss of respect for the process that I think leads inevitably to the conclusion on the part of everyday Americans that the whole thing is, as the president would say, fixed, that it's rigged, that none of it is legitimate. I think that's a very dangerous thing for a democracy. But because I want you guys to leave us on a cheery note, let me ask you...
what our favorite TV show is?
I don't want to give you a chance to promote your documentary.
Yes, sir.
We tend to think, whatever time you're in, you tend to think that this is extraordinary. We've never experienced anything like it. There is no precedent that would suggest it could get better. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be a cheery answer if you don't believe that there are historical precedents here, because there have been times in our country when we've had constitutional crises, when there have been, you mentioned the 30s, when, you know, the court steadfastly stood in the way of Roosevelt, which is why he wanted to pack the court. So we've had these epics. Do you see this as fundamentally different? Why do you see it as different? And do you see it improving? And what would cause it to improve? And I think maybe you should answer first, Jeffrey, because we might get out of Strauss a slightly more positive answer.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could tell you that I think there is some answer other than, you know, a complete repudiation of the current administration. I mean, I think Donald Trump is an order of magnitude different from any president I have encountered or heard about in terms of his demeanor, in terms of the way he expresses himself, in terms of an agenda that is driven by, rage at his predecessor, whom you're familiar with. I think, you know, I just think the difference in norms is so profound that we either have to, and the thing that I think people need to remember is that, you know, even if Donald Trump loses in 2020, everybody's going to remember that he won once, and there are going to be lots of people imitating him for the rest of all of our lives. And so I think, you know, the world is a permanently different place. Because,
Yeah, I guess my question is Donald Trump the cause of all of this, or is he a symptom of it? Mitch McConnell, I agree with you that he is an order of magnitude that we've never seen. Mitch McConnell did his thing to Merrick Garland before anyone ever imagined that Donald Trump was going to be president of the United States. Harry Reid ended the filibuster. The Republicans filibustered every Democratic judge, and Harry Reid ended the filibusters below the Supreme Court level before there was a Donald Trump. A lot of these things have been building. It's not as if, now he's turbocharged all of this. My question is, you know, is there a way back?
See, I don't know, but you know, one of the problems I have as a journalist is my own tendency, and certainly my profession's tendency, to engage in false equivalence. And I think, you know, you see it in news coverage. You saw it during the 2016 campaign, where Hillary Clinton's emails were presented as an equally problematic and evil part of her record compared to Donald Trump's business record, which I think was a false equivalence, and I regret my part in it, which was not trivial. And so, you know, what I think, you know, I think the radicalization of the Republican Party in recent years makes what's gone on in the Democratic Party pale in comparison. I don't think the Democratic Party has changed that much. It's somewhat more liberal than it used to be. But the Republican Party is unrecognizable from the Republican Party, even of the 1980s, and certainly of the 1970s and 1960s. You know, as for what can be done about that, it beats the hell out of me. I just don't know. I mean, you know, and I'm not trying to be facetious here. I don't know enough about how political movements work, how political parties change, to have some sort of picture in my head of how this might change. David, cheer us up, for God's sake.
Oh, man, I think you've come to the wrong place for that. I think I agree with Jeff. This is really not a law question. It's a question about political movements. So I've sort of, well, let me give you the pessimism first, then I'll give you the optimism. The pessimism is there's reason to think Trump is not just an American problem, because you do see these parallel things going on in other established democracies. And that makes you think it's not just a matter of getting rid of, you know, this guy.
Wow,
or
this is
maybe
even more
this
depressing
party.
than my answer. It's like the whole world.
But that is undoubtedly true.
And that's the sort of the post-World War II period of prosperity and kind of liberalism, small l, toleration, anti-discrimination, the muting of nationalism, that may have been an isolated period and the product of sort of particular historical circumstances, that the normal state of affairs is where all these tensions, ethnic tensions, and incipient authoritarianism is boiling over. That's the pessimistic view. Here's the somewhat more optimistic view. This is not the only time we've had really bad stuff going on American soil. And we tend to romanticize our history a little bit. I mean, you know, people talk about, you know, the Civil War. I mean, we needed the bloodiest civil war in history to overcome it. Very bad stuff went on in the 20s in the aftermath of World War I and the Red Scares. The stuff that was done in the American South to African Americans was an anti-democratic, authoritarian, racist regime supported by private terrorism. That's what was going on. And we overcame that. I'm not sure this is worse than that. And we were able to overcome that stuff.
Yes, and if I could, you know, here's an
He spurred you to optimism.
Yeah, he did actually.
I didn't think that was possible.
No, I mean, I'm like a cheerful guy. I'm not that pessimistic. But the one things we've learned under President Trump is the strength of other institutions in this country, and I think this has been a great time for the press, the news media. I think the news media is unintimidated and fearless in its reporting on the current administration. I think universities have been very important, particularly on issues like immigration and the Dreamers. I think the courts have stood up. That verdict is not in, but there's still a lot of judges out there who are very independent and very fearless. I think religious institutions, again, on immigration, have been terrific. So, the government...
Let me add to your list.
Yeah.
I want to say a word for citizens. I mean, we've seen a period of activism that we haven't seen in a very long time, and it's been impactful. And one of the questions is, does that period of activism translate into voter participation? But ultimately, there is a remedy to all of these problems, and they're contained within the power of citizens to go and demand something different through their votes.
And I got another one for you, another good one for you, which is, we always hear a lot about like the youth vote and young people, and Bernie Sanders had all these young... You know what we've learned in the period since that Trump took over? The power and importance of middle-aged and older women. That is like the single most forgotten demographic. Nobody sells them anything. You never see an ad on television aimed to middle-aged or older women. But that is a source of tremendous power in this country, often for the Democratic Party, African-American women. But I think recognition of the power of that group, which is definitely not, as cool as writing about college students, is also significant.
Well, with that shameless pander, let me, just kidding. Look, I think that one of the reasons there is an Institute of Politics is that we have a deep belief in all of these institutions and the genius of the Constitution to create the opportunity for all of these institutions to act as checks and balances, starting with citizens who are motivated to do so. And having someone like you and having Professor Strauss here on campus to illuminate these issues is extraordinarily important in that mission. And I have the good fortune of sitting around with you and chatting from time to time and getting the benefit of your wisdom. But it is a big thing for us that you would take the time and come and sit with us and talk about these issues. And we hope that it is the first of many visits here. And I know you have family in town, so I want to give you the opportunity to visit them often.
Good. And I feel cheered up already, man. This is great. Anyway, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. Thanks a lot.